This is Smile and Scars. It was one of those rare afternoons when the world felt perfectly still. The sun hung lazily over Los Angeles, spilling golden light across the quiet hills of a private neighborhood where luxury homes stood behind tall fences and manicured hedges. The only sound was the soft trickle of water from a fountain and the rhythmic chirping of cicadas. At the center of one of those large estates, Steven Seagal reclined by his pool. His home was a mix of Japanese simplicity and California openness. Bonsai trees lined the courtyard, and a koi pond shimmered beside the stone path that led to the pool deck. For once, the martial artist, actor, and philosopher wasn't training or working. He was simply enjoying silence. Clad in dark swim shorts and sunglasses, Seagal sat on a bamboo lounge chair, his massive frame at ease. A cool breeze brushed against his shoulders as he sipped iced tea from a tall glass. Years of action, films, and global travels had taught him to value moments like these. No cameras, no reporters, no chaos. Just sun, stillness, and water, but tranquility, it seemed, wasn't something everyone understood. Next door, behind a row of freshly planted hedges, a man named Cliff Harmon watched through his second-story window. Cliff was new to the neighborhood, a self-proclaimed businessman who spent more time bragging about his success than actually working. His house was big, modern, and painfully loud. Every weekend he threw parties that stretched past midnight. He didn't know most of his neighbors, and frankly, he didn't care to. But today, his attention had found an unfortunate target. Unbelievable, Cliff muttered, squinting through the blinds. That guy again. He didn't even know who Steven Seagal really was, only that he lived next door, kept to himself, and rarely smiled. Cliff had once tried to introduce himself, boasting about his expensive car and golf membership, but Seagal had simply nodded, thanked him politely, and walked away. That small dismissal burned deeper than Cliff wanted to admit. Now, as he saw Seagal stretched out by the pool, sun glistening off his tanned skin, something petty stirred inside him. Who does he think he is, lying out there like he owns the place? Of course, Steven did own the place. But reason wasn't exactly Cliff's strong suit. He glanced again, convinced that Seagal's peaceful sunbathing was some kind of affront to his status. His irritation quickly evolved into a ridiculous idea, one he justified with the smugness of someone who'd never faced consequences. He picked up his phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. "Yeah, hi," Cliff said when the operator answered. "I'd like to report a disturbance." The voice on the other end was calm. "What kind of disturbance, sir? My neighbors are behaving suspiciously," Cliff said, peering through his blinds like a spy in a bad movie. "He's out there in his pool area, lying half naked, and I think he's trespassing or something. Doesn't look right." The operator paused. "He's trespassing in his own pool, sir." Cliff hesitated, already realizing how ridiculous that sounded, but pressed on anyway. "Well, I'm not sure it's his pool. He moved in a while ago, doesn't talk to anyone, keeps weird hours. You know the type, sir," the operator said slowly. "This doesn't sound like an emergency." "I know," Cliff replied impatiently. "Just send someone to check it out, please. I pay a lot of taxes to live here. It's your job to make sure things are safe." The operator sighed quietly and logged the report. Within minutes, a black and white patrol car was dispatched. Back at Seagal's property, the world remained calm. A dragonfly hovered above the pool's surface. The koi moved in lazy circles under the reflection of palm fronds. Steven adjusted his sunglasses, eyes half closed, breathing in rhythm with the sound of water. That peace was interrupted by the faint echo of tires crunching on gravel. Steven lifted his head slightly, hearing the unmistakable sound of a car approaching his front gate. Moments later, a short buzz came from the intercom. "Mr. Seagal, this is LAPD," came a voice, professional and slightly uncertain. "Mind if we speak with you for a moment?" Steven sighed, his tranquility broken but his composure intact. He set his glass aside, rose from the chair, and wrapped a towel around his shoulders. The soft creak of the gate opening was followed by the appearance of two officers, one veteran and one clearly new to the force. They stopped in their tracks when they saw who was standing there. The senior officer blinked. "Wait, you're Steven Seagal." Steven nodded mildly. "That's right." The younger officer looked starstruck. "Sir, a big fan. Under Siege, right? I've seen that movie like 5 times. Steven gave a faint smile. "Glad to hear that. What brings you gentlemen here?" The senior officer glanced awkwardly at his notepad. "We got a call from a neighbor reporting suspicious activity. He's something about trespassing or public disturbance." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the absurdity of his own words. "But it looks like you're out in your own home." Steven raised an eyebrow. "That would be correct." The officers exchanged glances, both silently acknowledging the stupidity of the situation. "Would you happen to know which neighbor called?" the younger one asked. Steven glanced toward the hedge, where a sliver of movement betrayed someone watching. A curtain shifted. Cliff, unable to resist, peeked through the blinds again. Steven's eyes narrowed slightly. "I might have a guess." The officers followed his gaze and sighed. "That figures," the senior one muttered. Steven chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Don't worry about it, officers. I appreciate you checking in, just doing your job." "Of course, sir," the older officer said. "Sorry to bother you." They turned to leave, but Steven paused. "Actually," he said calmly, "why don't you stay for a moment? I think my neighbor deserves to learn something about respect." Both officers looked at each other, unsure what he meant. But before they could respond, Steven walked toward the low hedge dividing his property from Cliff's. His movements were slow, deliberate, not aggressive, but impossibly steady. That quiet power in his stride made both officers instinctively step back. Cliff froze at the window, eyes wide as Steven's unmistakable silhouette appeared near the property line. His confidence began to melt. He hadn't expected the police to actually talk to Seagal, and now as the man himself approached, calm as a storm cloud, Cliff's stomach twisted. Steven stopped just short of the fence, looking toward the window without raising his voice. "Everything all right over there, neighbor?" He called, his tone calm but carrying that edge of command honed over decades of martial discipline. Cliff's mouth went dry. "Why?" Yeah, everything's fine," he stammered through the glass. Steven tilted his head slightly, an almost imperceptible smirk forming. "Good to know." Then he turned, heading back toward the officers, who couldn't hide their amusement. The stage was set. The neighbor had made his call, and Steven Seagal, calm, composed, unshaken, was about to show him what true presence looked like. The next few minutes would make Cliff wish he had never picked up that phone. The air around the two neighboring properties felt heavier now, not because of anger, but because of that unmistakable silence that always comes before a man realizes he's made a huge mistake. Cliff Harmon stood frozen behind his window blinds, still gripping his phone. He could see Steven Seagal standing calmly at the property line, the two police officers beside him looking equal parts amused and uncomfortable. Cliff's pulse hammered in his neck. His little act of pettiness had spiraled into something he hadn't imagined, a confrontation with a man whose quiet reputation spoke louder than any threat could. The senior officer turned toward Cliff's driveway and sighed. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered to his partner. Both officers walked to Cliff's gate, pressing the buzzer. "Mr. Harmon," the older one called, "you mind stepping outside for a moment?" Cliff hesitated. Yeah, sure, 1 sec." He splashed water on his face in the kitchen sink, trying to steady himself. "He's just a man," he told himself. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just called the cops, that's all." But deep down he knew. He'd crossed a line for no reason except ego. When he finally stepped out his front door, the sight before him made his throat dry up. Steven Seagal stood on the other side of the hedge, arms crossed loosely, calm as ever. The police officers turned toward him. "Mr. Harmon," the senior cop began, "we responded to your call about a supposed trespasser. Turns out that man is your next-door neighbor, Mr. Steven Seagal, and he was just sunbathing in his own backyard. Care to explain why you reported him?" Cliff's eyes darted nervously between the officers and Seagal. I thought," I mean, from where I was standing, it looked like someone else. You know, for safety reasons, The older officer raised an eyebrow. For safety reasons, yeah, Cliff said weakly. This neighborhood's supposed to be quiet. You never know who's hanging around. The younger cop couldn't help but snort softly. Sir, Mr. Seagal has lived here for years. Pretty sure the only thing dangerous about him is his IMDb page. Even Seagal cracked a faint smile at that. Cliff's face turned red. He forced out a laugh, trying to diffuse his own humiliation. Oh, that Steven Seagal. Yeah, of course. Didn't recognize him without the ponytail. Seagal tilted his head, his eyes narrowing just slightly. That subtle shift in expression made Cliff's words die in his throat. I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding. Cliff said quickly, didn't mean anything by it. The senior officer crossed his arms. Well, that misunderstanding wasted department time and resources. Maybe next time you should check your facts before calling the police. Cliff's voice dropped to a nervous mumble. Yeah, you're right. The officers exchanged glances, then turned back towards Seagal. Sorry again for the disturbance, sir. The senior one said. We'll file this as resolved. Seagal nodded. Appreciate it, gentlemen. You handled it fine. The two cops tipped their hats and returned to their cruiser, leaving Cliff alone under the burning gaze of embarrassment, and under Seagal's quiet, unreadable stare. For a long moment neither man spoke. The sound of birds returned. The wind shifted through the palms. Finally, Seagal stepped closer to the hedge, his voice calm but carrying the weight of experience. You know. He said, there's a kind of energy in this world that always comes back to you. Whatever you send out, good or bad, it circles right back. Cliff swallowed. Look, I said I was sorry, man. I heard you, Seagal replied, but maybe you should understand why you're sorry. Cliff frowned defensively. I just made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. That's true, Seagal said, but most people don't mistake peace for a threat. That line hit harder than a punch. Cliff's face flushed deeper. What's that supposed to mean? Seagal stepped to the edge of the hedge, resting his hand lightly on the top. You looked out your window and saw a quiet man minding his own business. He said evenly. But your ego couldn't handle stillness. You saw what you didn't understand, and you called for help instead of just letting peace exist next to you. Cliff blinked, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. You wanted control. Seagal continued, his voice low, steady, but unmistakably powerful. That's why men like you pick fights that don't exist. But control doesn't come from noise, it comes from calm. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle rustle of water from the pool behind him. Then, just as quietly, Seagal turned and began to walk back toward his deck. The conversation was over, at least for him. Cliff stood frozen, unsure what to say or do. He wanted to shout, to defend himself, to reclaim some dignity. But instead, he just watched as Steven Seagal draped his towel over the back of the lounge chair and sat back down, unfazed, as if the entire event had been nothing more than a ripple in the water. The lesson hung heavy in the air. Later that evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Cliff sat alone in his backyard, staring into his empty pool. The laughter from his usual group of party friends felt distant. The incident replayed in his mind over and over, the sight of Seagal's calm, the quiet authority in his tone, the way the officers looked at him like he was the fool in a story everyone else already understood. For the first time in years, Cliff didn't feel loud, he didn't feel in control, he just felt small. He looked toward the hedge separating their properties. The sound of crickets filled the air. Somewhere beyond, he could faintly hear the soft strum of a guitar, Seagal's voice humming an old blues tune. Cliff took a deep breath, stood up, and walked to the hedge. For a moment he hesitated, a pride-battling conscience. Then finally he spoke. Hey, Steven, he called quietly. The music stopped. Seagal's deep voice answered, steady and calm. Yeah, I just wanted to say I was wrong. Shouldn't have called the cops. I let something stupid get in my head. There was a pause. Then Seagal replied, that's a good start. And then, after a beat, you want a drink, I've got iced tea. Cliff blinked in surprise. Yeah, sure." Moments later, he found himself stepping through the gate for the first time, crossing into Seagal's yard. The lights of the pool glowed soft blue. Seagal handed him a cold glass and motioned to the empty chair beside him. They sat in silence for a long moment, two neighbors, no longer adversaries, just men under the same fading sun. "You train?" Seagal asked finally, his tone casual. Cliff shook his head. "Nah, haven't since high school." Seagal chuckled. "Maybe you should start again, helps quiet the mind." Cliff smiled weakly. "Yeah, maybe I should." As the evening deepened, their conversation drifted about discipline, noise, peace, and how easily people lose sight of what matters. For the first time, Cliff listened more than he spoke. When he went home that night, something had changed. He didn't know how to describe it, but he felt lighter, calmer. The next day, instead of blasting music or boasting on calls, Cliff spent the morning tending to his garden quietly. He even waved to Seagal when he saw him by the pool. Seagal nodded back just once. And though the world didn't change, that small exchange, one nod, one lesson, was enough to remind them both that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits quietly by the water, unbothered, unbreakable, and at peace.